Kayla, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing swimmingly. I am super pumped. You are here. You work for the Water Board, Idaho Water Board. We're going to talk about cloud seeding, the history of water in Idaho. This is a big deal. It's an even bigger deal every time I talk to some, like Ada County commissioners. They come in and Tom Daly was articulating. He's like, look, we are developing at a rapid speed and we are not developing it's not like more water is coming. We just have more people drawing on the straws, from our aquifers and then from obviously surface water. But these are big problems. You deal in the cloud seeding, you deal with trying to bring more water resources and preserve water in the state of Idaho. Hit me with some background.
Yeah, so I guess to get started, I think a lot of folks don't even understand conceptually what cloud seeding is. So I think that might be kind of an important segue is what is cloud seeding? And really cloud seeding is a form of precipitation enhancement or a way of enhancing natural precipitation. And so here in Idaho, we utilize cloud seeding to increase our snow, which ultimately results in increased snowpack. And our snowpack are our primary water storage reservoirs, and water is the lifeblood of our state, right? And so here in Idaho, our goal is to increase our snowpack. But cloud seeding is used in other parts of the world, both for rain enhancement, as well as hail mitigation. So like in the Midwest and Canada, there's actually insurance companies who will pay for cloud seeding for hail mitigation to reduce damage to crops and infrastructure. And so it can be used in a variety of different ways, but obviously...
Wait, I don't mean to interrupt. Okay, how do you get to reducing giant golf ball size hails by doing cloud seeding? Is it that it coaxes out the precipitation before it condenses into a hard ball?
Exactly, right? So hailstones, the larger they get, the more damaging they can be. So the idea is that if you can start that precipitation process earlier in a storm, you prevent them from becoming large enough where they become damaging to crops and infrastructure. And so we don't have the type of weather systems here to do that type of cloud seeding. That's the type of stuff that they deal with a lot in the Midwest. So I'm definitely not as informed on what we call warm season cloud seeding. So generally there's cloud seeding that can be done in the warm season or summer months. That's when hail mitigation and rain enhancement projects, and not just here in the United States, but in other parts of the world too. The Middle East especially has, made a lot of investments into cloud seeding over the last several years. So this is not just something that's evolving, here in the United States and the drought-stricken Western United States, but it's happening on a larger, world front. People are looking at cloud seeding because really, if you don't live next to large water bodies like the ocean or somewhere, there's no way to bring new water to a basin, right? It's the only mechanism that we have to generate, more water supply. We can conserve it, we can move it around, we can change our use, but it's really the only tool that we have to bring more water supply to a basin. And so that's why a lot of states, public entities and not only here in the US, but other parts of the world, resource managers are like, well, this is a tool that we might be able to use to enhance water supply. And so that's largely why cloud seeding has, grown, especially here in Idaho.
We have had in Idaho, before I moved here, but in the last 10 years, we've had a lot of problems with water and water supply, especially considering that the southern belt of Idaho, we were chatting just before we started, the southern belt of Idaho obviously is the agricultural, engine for the state of Idaho. And we're all drawing from this basin, the Snake Plains Aquifer. That is also a hotbed of the population, right? It's not just the economic, but it's, where the population explosion is happening. And obviously, you have stuff up north, but here is really where a lot of people are moving. And because of that, we have more developments drawing, on straws and wells and aquifers. We have more things, more pressure on a limited resource. Take me back. What were some of the big problems that started happening in the teens as far as development and really reconciling, okay, we have this agricultural need for water. We have a really complex system of junior and senior water rights with different mechanisms. You have surface waters and you have pump farmers that are junior water rights compared to the senior water rights that are the surface water. And that has created a lot of conflict. We saw it just this year. Everybody thought it was, everybody that was watching social media thought it was cobalt mining. And obviously there are no cobalt mines on the Snake Plains Aquifer. But there are a lot of concerns that we saw the fallout of, which is, hey, we're starting to run out of water. We're starting to run out of this resource. We've drawn down aquifers in the area significantly, and we're starting to see the repercussions of that.
That's correct. Yeah. So Really, I would say taking a step back at cloud seeding and looking kind of at the history of how it evolved. It's
Grab this
water.
guy just a little bit closer. There
Yeah,
you go.
yeah,
There you go. There you
absolutely.
go.
Yeah, looking at the history of cloud seeding and how it evolved, water supply, ag is a big driver here in our state, certainly because it supports our economy. But, a lot of the things that we know and love about Idaho, the beautiful mountains and rivers, all of that's possible because of water, all of the recreation, the fisheries that we enjoy. So it's not just agriculture. And so really taking a step back, cloud seeding's been going on in Idaho since about the 1950s, the early 1950s. And it was all local stakeholders, local water users in the basins that operated them, that invested, that funded them, and that conducted the operations. And so these were largely up until about the early 2000s. These were largely manual ground generator projects. So we didn't use aircraft until early into the 2000s. And a lot of those projects, they kind of started and stopped consistently with some of the water supply. We didn't have a lot of the early evidence that cloud seeding, the proof that cloud seeding works, kind of that groundbreaking evidence. And so people's willingness to invest in cloud seeding over the decades, kind of ebbed and flowed with the water supply need. If there wasn't a lot of water supply, suddenly people were like, yeah, cloud seeding could be, something to support us in these conditions. But when water supply is good, the funding didn't seem to be there because there wasn't a need. And that's kind of like a large misconception with, cloud seeding, because just like the water year, is constantly going to be changing, and so, in the 90s was really kind of the first evolution in cloud seeding in Idaho. And that's when Idaho Power started looking into cloud seeding to support hydropower generation. And so they began investigating that in the 90s. Hydropower supports electric generation. We have some of the cheapest electricity in the United States here in the West. And so that's why they started supporting it. They're a public utility and they wanted to support cheap utilities. And so they initially developed the first project in the Payette River Basin. It took years of investigation, right? This wasn't something that happened overnight. It kind of started with a stakeholder question in the 90s. And it wasn't until the 2000s, after they had done a lot of legwork and research on the development and implementation of a project, till they really started cloud seeding in the Payette River Basin. And so they started seeding in the Payette. They grew that project a bit. And then it, kind of jumping ahead, it wasn't until 2008 until we were kind of talking about some of these water supply issues that you just mentioned down in the ESPA, or what we call the Eastern Snake River Plain Aquifer. It's generally what we call the ESPA region. And so when we were negotiating kind of management of that system and how we sustain that water supply, Idaho Power is a stakeholder in that conversation as well, because they have hydropower generation all down the Snake River. And so they basically came to the table as the stakeholders in the state were having these negotiations, and they said, hey, look, we've done cloud seeding in the Payette River Basin. We've been successful. Maybe cloud seeding can be a tool that can support water supply in this basin as well. And so really the idea was that Idaho Power would come in, they would operate this 5-year pilot project, so sort of a test, run to see how many cloud seeding opportunities there were, how, roughly, get an estimate on how much water it could precipitate, which you have to have some operational data to do. And so they came in, that's exactly what happened. They ran this 5-year project from about 2008 to 2013-14. And during that time, water users in other basins, so in the Boise and the Wood River Basin, were like, well, Idaho Power is growing this project in the Upper Snake. They've been successful in the Payette. And so the water users in those basins actually approached Idaho Power and they said, hey, will you consider bringing projects to these basins as well? Because we have water supply challenges that we need to address in these basins. And so, the Boise River Basin is a little interesting because they had actually been conducting cloud seeding, at least the water users had kind of on their own, the ground seeding projects for about a decade, really, before they approached Idaho Power. And so really that evolution was because Idaho Power was kind of growing their technology, advancing, their use of cloud seeding, and they were collaborating, on funding. And so the idea was, that maybe they could collaborate in these other basins as well. And so those collaborations were initiated kind of 2013-14, and then right about that time was when the state kind of came back on. And that was the end of the pilot project. Idaho Power came back to the state. They said, hey, look, we've been successful. State, will you start partnering, for supporting cloud seeding? More water supports a variety of, different uses. It supports the sustainability of our water supply. So maybe there's interest for the state to participate in this. And so the state's really first initial investment was capital funding to like build out some of the infrastructure. And at that time, there wasn't any evidence that there was really any negative impacts. We had, some of the groundbreaking research had happened right about that time in 2017, demonstrating that it worked. And so we had a water supply need. But we obviously,
Could I, when you said there were no, at that time, there was no indication of negative impacts. That's not for lack of looking, right? Like it's not, this was not, and again, it's been explained to me. It's like, this was not a program that people just went into willy nilly. And they're like, well, nobody's died, so like we should be okay. But it's like, no. This is we're using silver iodide. We're using it in this way. Let's test in and outside of the distribution area. Let's rigorously compare, control groups, the whole thing, and let's see if there's any indication that we even have a cursory effect in any areas. And it has been overwhelmingly non-existent effect. Right.
And so, you think about on a worldwide basis, cloud seeding has been occurring for nearly 8 decades, and in nearly 8 decades of cloud seeding operations occurring worldwide. And you have states like Texas, California, Utah, all across the West. We've been cloud seeding for decades, and there's still no evidence because of the amounts that we use for it ever to accumulate. And so, as a state, when you're looking at that information, you have all these public agencies around you. There's, some of them have done pre and post seeding. In Australia, for example, they've done a lot of pre and post seeding evaluations where they go out into the environment and they try and find it, and measure it before and after. And even still, in Australia, Wyoming has done similar things. They've gone out and measured it in the environment. You imagine if you took a vial of dust, so we're talking about grams of particulates that are dumped out of an airplane, and you spread it out over a basin, and I told you to go find all those particles. What's the likelihood you think that you would be able to go find all those particulates, right? And so that's what we're kind of saying, you could get hit by a bus walking down the street. You could, get hit by lightning, but the likelihood of those happening is so small. And so, the likelihood of that ever occurring or causing impact, that we don't consider it to be negative. So yes.
Right. And again, I don't mean to interrupt. I think the bus example is an interesting one because it's not like, if you look at the individual level, you think of the bus, it's like, well, look, if I get hit by a bus, I really care because I'm hit by a bus and it's over now. I had a good run and good night, right? But I think the more appropriate analogy would be like, all right, look, do we think that the frequency of bus hits is so significant that it's actually damaging our population or harming our populace? The answer is no, because it's so, even though for that one person, it would be bad, it's not something that occurs with any kind of frequency or we have any kind of indication that it's this like wide scale damage thing. So it's like, hey, look, what are the odds that you go out and you find a tiny particulate of silver iodide? It's like, yeah, you might be able to find one. But the idea that it has this widespread effect on our population appears to be, as all of the research that I've been shown and people have talked about, it appears to be zero. But when you say a vial, is that actually how much you guys like? What's the quantity of this material that's getting like silver iodide, right?
Yeah,
that's what you guys use for seeding?
Correct. So silver iodide is a compound salt, right? It's made up of silver and iodide. And basically those things are so tightly bonded together that you could never get free silver. And that's generally, free silver, the silver in its elemental form is generally what people consider harmful. And so, yes, there is, like if you look at an MSDS guidebook, for example, there is, information on silver iodide that says under certain quantities, it can have certain effects. But again, we're talking about in concentration, like silver iodide is used in photography, antiseptics, and it's considered safe under certain circumstances, like a number of different elements because of the concentration, right? And so when we're cloud seeding, you're dumping it out of an airplane, right? And so we go back to this, kind of idea of trying to find a granule of sand, for example, that you dumped out of an airplane, trying to go find that over the Payette River Basin somewhere. It's really unlikely that it would ever concentrate in an area, either in the soils, in the water, or even in an area where a human could come touch or inhale, right? It would never accumulate, to match those quantities that something like an MSDS guidebook, for example, would say could potentially cause, impacts. And so basically what we've done is we've gone back and we've calculated these amounts. So for example, a flare used for cloud seeding, so the flares that attach to the back of an airplane, they have about 15 grams of silver iodide in them. There's about 128 grams in an ounce. So like a little ramekin that you would get your salad dressing side at a restaurant is about an ounce, right? So if you think about, I don't know, roughly, have a great estimate on how many flares we use per operation, but they're on each of the wingtips. You can only expend them once during the operation, so if you think about even, 4 ounces is way more than we would release in a seeding operation, but, 4 ounces is a half a glass. If you dump that out of an airplane, it's going to spread out over an entire basin. It's never going to accumulate in a small area. You're never going to be able to go find it. And so even if you compounded that over years, and you turned that into a pound, or whatever it would be of silver iodide, like over 10 or 15 years, I'll be clear, I don't know the exact math on it, but when you add that up, even again, like if you took a pound of flour, I don't even know if they sell it in a pound, it comes in like 5-pound bags, right?
Yeah.
So it's not very much. And if you're thinking about that's the amount you used over several years, again, you dump that out of an airplane. If I told you to go find it, the likelihood that you'd even be able to find 2 particles of that same bag of flour is pretty low, right? It would never happen. And so again, that's why we largely consider cloud seeding to be safe. So there's no evidence that it could accumulate, but there's undeniable evidence it can create water, and so that's really kind of where we are with cloud seeding and kind of why the state is like, well, there's clear evidence it can generate water, and it's basically kind of mathematically impossible for the amount of particulate used to accumulate in a large area to ever be considered, impactful,
Potentially, harmful or something.
Right.
And if you, one thing because I've been thinking about this a lot, it's like, okay, I don't want to be breathing in bad things. I don't think anybody does.
Right.
And everybody engaged in this, including yourself, is like, you live in the area. I live in the area.
Right.
Like it'd be pretty wild for somebody to be like, okay, Kayla has like a death wish and she's using cloud seeding to not only increase water, but also to like fulfill her death wish. It's like, okay, that's not a very reasonable argument. But the other thing that I worry about far more is like brake dust, right? Like you have cars, like everybody has cars, and we all have our brake pads wearing down, and there's all this dust at the side of the road. Like you go over to highway or freeway or something, and you just like, you rub your hand on the road, your hand's going to come up dirty. That is very clear bad stuff that's existing in our environment that individuals participate in, including myself. But there are things like that where it's like, okay, if I'm worried about something, I think brake dust has a far worse, and the quantities of brake dust that we have in the area has a far worse respiratory effect than anything else that I could come into contact with at this point. I mean, obviously exhaust from cars is not great, but there are obviously natural cleaning mechanisms within our environment that deal with these things. But like, again, from a respiratory standpoint, it's like I can go out to any road and point to essentially an accumulation of brake dust. If I'm really worried about doing something to improve my respiratory environment and engagement, dealing with brake dust is probably far more important than like going after a couple ramekins of silver iodide.
Right, exactly. And that's sort of kind of how we look at it. There's monumental evidence, compounding evidence of drought and the impacts from drought on fisheries, on recreation, on our water supply that affects our economy. I mean, we talked about there's even communities that are facing water supply, loss, entire communities, cities, that are facing the potential of not having water. And that's critical. Water is literally the lifeblood, not just to our state in Idaho, but all life. It's very critical that we have water. And so when you're facing these critical issues, and again, you have zero evidence, of there really at this point ever being a potential for negative effects, you are kind of weighting those benefits, the weighting, what's more necessary, if you will. And so I think some of the dust examples are definitely like more drastic, and weighting, one, what's worse, one versus the other. But I would say in this situation, we feel pretty confident, that regardless of what's, causing drought, regardless of what's causing the changes in our climatology, we all kind of acknowledge that it's happening. We all acknowledge that there's an increase in demand, or that the water supply demand is facing shortages, right? And so that's something we all acknowledge. And so that's really kind of the trade-off, and why the state started participating is, we need water. And so this is our next opportunity. But, going even further, we're also expending public funds. And so if we're going to expend public funds, then how much water are we generating? Is it actually an efficient use of our funds? Or should we be focusing our energies on other types of, water management uses or technologies?
Storage,
Right.
yeah, recharge, things of that nature.
Right.
What is the ROI as far as funds? Because this is something that people brought up. They're like, they spend $5 million. I don't know why I did that voice, but somebody said that they were like, they spend $5 million of taxpayer money on this water. Like, is that accurate?
No, that's not accurate. So in fact, kind of going back to the history and how the board started participating. So, right, they needed to understand the water supply. They needed to be able to evaluate it, how much water. And so to do that, you need tools and technology, right? You need models pretty much to answer those questions, and models need data. Well, you have to develop the models first, right? And so cloud seeding is this new technology where we just proved it worked back in 2017, right? That fundamental groundbreaking science happened right here in Idaho in 2017. And in terms of the speed of the science, that's like a couple minutes ago, right? Like we just figured out it worked. Now to figure out how it works, how well it can work, how efficient it is, what are the small microphysics or characteristics that make it happen? Those are things that you have to understand to teach a model to replicate the process, right? Because you want a tool that can basically go back and replicate the natural process. And you say, okay, if I cloud seeding, then what's going to happen, right? Because you can't really go out and do that in the natural environment. So you need tools to do that. And so back in 2017, Idaho Power had already talked to the board about funding some of the capital build out. But we had this need to address this question of how much water are we generating? And so at that point, the board kind of decided to start investing in some of these tools to answer these questions. And so when people say $5 million, that's the total program budget, but only a portion of that goes towards operations. And the board really hasn't contributed any money towards capital investments or growing cloud seeding or growing the program really since about 2015. And so the bulk of their investments, so just to give you, kind of a rough dollar figure, it's roughly a couple $2 to $3 million to operate what we call the collaborative program. And so the remaining few million of that budget every year is to develop these models, the tools and technologies so that we can respond to these policy questions. We can respond to the public, and so that we have data and evidence to demonstrate to the public that we are using the state's funds cost efficiently to generate water, which is a very valuable resource. And so the board's budget has certainly grown over the last several years, but that hasn't been to support growth in cloud seeding. That's solely been to support investments into the tools and technologies and assessments that can answer these questions and be responsive to the public.
So the $5 million, there's an annual budget that the Idaho Water Resource Board gets on, again, annually. And what you're saying is, it's not like the $5 million that people talk about, like we're giving $5 million to cloud seeding. That's not accurate because yes, although a portion of the $5 million, some portion does go to operations of cloud seeding, we're no longer making grand capital investments into infrastructure and whatnot. And a large part of it is an investment in studying, justifying, research, communicating with people. It's other things outside of clouds because that's not the only thing the Water Resource Board does. Like the Water Resource Board is not solely focused on cloud seeding. You're focused on the water resource in the state as a whole, in not just this area, but all of the state, all of the different ways that water can be done. I mean, obviously the research on how to recharge aquifers, how to transport water efficiently, what the impacts of additional developments are. Like you guys deal with every single aspect of water in the state.
Right, that's correct. And so, I mean, the challenge of that is, that this is sort of something that all water resource managers across all of the Western states are dealing with. And I think the thing to be clear on with cloud seeding is that it's not a holy grail, right? It's not going to fix drought. It's not going to, fix our water challenges, but it's certainly a tool to be used in the toolbox. And it's a new and evolving tool that we need to be able to understand and be responsive of questions to. But we're also not the only people asking these questions, right? I mean, you think about the state of Utah next door, their cloud seeding operations for the last 3 decades, the state has partnered with water users and their budget has been less than $500,000 until last year. Their budget grew from $500,000 to over $10 million in 1 year for cloud seeding alone. And again, it's because it's the only tool that we have to invest in new water supply. And so that's largely kind of what's driving the interest in cloud seeding as well, is all of a sudden you have these states who are making large investments into developing cloud seeding projects, and people are suddenly understanding that it's been going on for quite some time, just not at this scale. But the reason it's finally growing is because of some of this groundbreaking evidence that's only recently occurred in the last several years.
Right, because figuring out exactly the ROI, like how much are you actually coaxing out? How much more precipitation are you coaxing out? How much more snowpack are you getting? What's the downstream effect with hydroelectric, agriculture, recreation? Like those are a lot of variables. It's like, okay, well, we got this much. How much would we have gotten if we hadn't done this? And now we did it this year. Like it's just very difficult to get that data. So I can imagine the scientific process of conclusively saying, okay, we know for sure, or like a really high likelihood that we had this effect, and that led to this triple tier of benefit at in these different areas. I can imagine that's really difficult, but once you have that, that's really valuable. Like that's the nugget that says, okay, green light, this we get an ROI that we can justify, or red light, this doesn't make sense for us to do.
Right. Yeah. So,
I'm sorry, go.
No, I was gonna. I would say that the cloud seeding, the biggest evolution, or this groundbreaking science that's important to that people talk about, like why do we all of a sudden believe that it's, going to work? And that's because of research. We're very fortunate here in Idaho that was done right here in Idaho. And so the National Center for Atmospheric Research, they, sort of house some of the world's leading experts in atmospheric science. And they were funded by the National Science Foundation in partnership with a number of different universities to basically come into Idaho to the Payette River Basin, set up cloud seeding operations, and then they brought in like those Doppler on wheels, so the things you see in storm chasers, like chasing tornadoes. So they brought in
Twister.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to comment on that movie, by the way.
Oh my God. The original Twister, I watched that movie like 1,000 times. I even had the soundtrack on CD. How lame. Man, what a film.
I can appreciate
What
that.
a film. That was was that Helen Hunt in that movie? God, I swear I had such a thing for Helen Hunt too. And she was like the rambunctious tornado chaser. They had the dude from not Enter the Dragon. What was that like fourth Hannibal Lecter movie where the actor, really popular actor who is also in, it doesn't matter. He died from like a heroin overdose recently, like a couple years back.
I'm not sure.
Come on. He was fantastic. But anyway, that was one of the first movies. I'm like, because I really liked him later in life. And then I was like, oh my God, this was like one of his original roles. He was like one of the dudes driving around the truck, that like would drop to the ground.
But those same radars, right?
Yeah,
so
sorry.
That they had on the back of trucks. No, I can totally appreciate it. I'm very passionate about weather myself. But so we essentially.
I'm passionate about that movie. Like the movie was like I like good weather. I don't think I'm an idiot. Just keep going.
No worries.
Pay no attention to me.
So back the cloud seeding research, they basically came to the Payette River Basin. They brought these radars in on trucks, and then they brought in like 75 different weather instruments, and they also brought in an aircraft that was fixed with weather instruments. And so they basically came in to get like a 4D picture of the atmosphere, and then run cloud seeding operations so they could see what happens. And so when they did that, you've seen a radar, right? And the color changes based on precipitation, and that's sort of the ice reflectivity. And so if you're looking at this radar, there's no precipitation happening in this basin. And then all of a sudden we start running cloud seeding operations, and you can see exactly behind the seeding plane a trail, like a zigzag pattern. And so this is kind of one of the things when I go back to, like lines in the sky, like cloud seeding operations are conducted in a zigzag pattern, right? So it's very unnatural, right? That would never happen in a natural setting. And so here we are doing this research. We got a 4D picture of the atmosphere, and this cloud seeding airplane comes through, and we have a perfect zigzag pattern on radar. And I mean, PNAS, the publication for National Academy of Sciences, came out with an article that said there's unambiguous evidence. I mean, everybody saw it on the radar screen, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is the proof it created precipitation, and so like you imagine, like there's researchers that have been, trying to understand cloud seeding for decades, since the 50s and 60s. And these guys are finally like, the Holy Grail just happened. We saw it on a radar, it generated precipitation. We've seen it in a lab. We've seen some of the older pictures of an airplane racetracks in the cloud that kind of float around the internet. But they never actually like demonstrated with science and technology that cloud seeding could work. And so that happened here in 2017 in Idaho, right? And so that was sort of the catalyst in the industry and why a lot of people are suddenly like, okay, it works. We're still not seeing any evidence that accumulation could ever occur and we need water. And so all of the sudden since 2017, not just here in Idaho, but even on an international front, not even just here in the United States, we're seeing all this rapid growth. And that groundbreaking research, I do want to be clear, is proof of the conceptual model of cloud seeding for cold season, right? So we're not talking about hail mitigation. We're not talking about rain enhancement. And it was pretty specific to aircraft as well, right? When we did this investigation. And so aircraft, is not used by all programs in the Western United States. I would say a bulk of them kind of use the ground generator or the ground operations. But yeah, this basically we had the proof. And so now, we have to understand, well, we know it works, but why does it work? What are the physical components that make it work? How can we improve it? How much water are we generating? And then some of the obvious questions when you're asking how much water are we generating? Are we impacting, other users downwind? And that, similar to kind of the silver iodide, you go to these kind of like large concepts of, a cloud, for example, they're not very efficient at generating precipitation. So to give you some numbers here, like a cloud that you see in the sky, on average, they'll only precipitate about 6% of the total water in the atmosphere, right? It will precipitate out of a cloud. And so if we're trying to do cloud seeding out of a cloud, we're really affecting less than 1% of the water, all of the water content in the atmosphere, right? And so the blue sky that you see, there's water in the blue sky. It's just in gas form. The water that you see in a cloud is water in a liquid form. So that's why you can see a cloud. That's sort of, the difference between clouds. So sorry, I totally lost my train of thought there. I'm like,
yeah, listen, you're good. We don't have to go through like, here's a question for you. And I've thought about this a lot. It's like, why is there just this gigantic anxiety about cloud seeding? And again, I'm an idiot. I don't know anything about cloud seeding aside from what you've told me and what I heard from Cresta. But, and this is obviously a question kind of outside of potentially your area of expertise, but do you think that there's an aspect of kind of like God of the gaps that engages where people are like, okay, look, I see this thing. I don't feel right, or they're worried about sickness, illness, and whatever it might be. And then there's this other thing over here that they don't understand and is potentially upsetting, right? Like the idea that, something's getting shot out the back of an airplane, even though, we engage with, brake dust and exhaust from cars every day. Okay, fine. And then they take this, they're like, okay, I have these problems and this is the reason. And it's because it's potentially unfamiliar, so it creates more anxiety with it. And it's an unknown process that it's like, I don't interact with this every day. And then they fill that gap and they're like, hey, this is the problem, right? Because in all the conversations I've had with people that are against cloud seeding, it always comes down to they're shooting bromide or blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, they're not. It's just silver iodide. And like, I'm not saying silver iodide is great. I'm just saying that what you're saying is not true, right? Like it's silver iodide. And then it comes down to, other things like, liabilities or, quantities or where the studies or whatever it might be. And, all it really takes is somebody online to say, there's never been any study to say this is safe. It's like, how do you mean? Like what, like, did you consume the entire body of science research for like the history of everything? And like, you have determined that nobody, it's like, there's no obligation to actually back up the claim. They're just like, oh, it's HARP. I'm like, what? Like, what do you, so do you think that the anxiety around this, and again, maybe not the right question to ask you, at least comes from a gross misunderstanding and an anxiety that like things aren't right. And I think this is the reason things aren't right.
Absolutely. I think it goes back to this fundamental idea that we sort of make up what we don't know, right? If you don't understand how something works or the process, then you sort of kind of come up with these hypotheses in your mind for what it could be or how it could work. And so I think for a lot of people, they just quite simply don't understand what it is, like the very basic information fundamentally of how it works. And once you do understand some of those fundamentals, it becomes kind of obvious, why it's why, maybe concerns aren't warranted. And so we want to be very careful, because we acknowledge that the public has these concerns, and we're not saying that they're not real. You don't want to invalidate those for people. They have concerns, but you also need to help them understand, that they're maybe not warranted, right? That maybe if we just showed them, simple education, or if they had kind of a conceptual understanding of what we were doing, and how vital it is to our water supply and other things, that affect us or that could have, serious effect. I think that helps people relieve those anxieties, because they're like, oh, I don't know what I was so worried about, we're not, creating lines in the sky from cloud seeding, because cloud seeding depletes a cloud. It doesn't create clouds, right? We're talking about two very different physical processes. And so when people kind of understand those fundamentals, I feel like it reduces that anxiety, or kind of going back to that fundamental idea that people make up what they don't know. When you inform them and they kind of understand these basic concepts, and you're not, kind of snowballing them with these high technical ideas or political responses, to answering their questions, you're very much just getting down to the nitty gritty on a normal level with people. I think that relieves a lot of that anxiety.
I have to admit something to you, and I'm not proud of this. Okay. I've had a cough. Like, my dad got a really bad cough like a month ago, and I got a bad, and like, little kids, right? You have illness roaming through your house. And I was coming to do this interview, and I was like, what if you're wrong, man? Like, what if the cloud seeding is like the silver's in your lungs? And it's like, so I had this, but like, I have these thoughts too. And again, I'm an idiot. I don't know anything. So I'm like, what if, like, and it's not even what if I'm wrong? Because I'm not even saying I know anything. That's why I'm talking to you. But I started listing in my head the things that also could be contributing to, my cough, right? It's like, all right, well, look, your fence backs up to a field that flies a drone, pesticide sprayer, right? And I also have a fence that borders a common space grass area, and they spray pesticides and weed killer and stuff on that. We've had fires for like the last 90 days, 120 days. Like, I couldn't even see the hills around my house for some time. Like, I just started going through all of these things, and cloud seeding doesn't operate in Idaho in the summer months. It operates during a winter storm in the winter, right? Like, all of these things is like, okay, well, you have enough right in front of your face to clearly point out any kind of respiratory distress you may be in, aside from just basic illness, because you have little kids in elementary school that are coming home and like touching everything, and then you give them a hug and a kiss, and then you get sick. And it's like, wow, man, there's so much more. If I was really worried about my respiratory health, and thankfully my cough is pretty much gone, but if I was really worried about my respiratory health, I have like a dozen other right in front of my face anxieties that I have been interacting with all summer that I could point to before I got to, oh my God, it's Kayla and her cloud seeding, right? Like, it's just, my point is, I'm not immune from it either. Even though I've had conversations where, like, with you and other people, I'm like, wow, that's really compelling. Like, I would like to know more about this 100%, but it is really compelling. And even with that, I'm not immune from it. So when you say, like, when we talk about anxieties people have, I have them too, right? Like, I get worried about it. I don't want my kids to live an unhealthy life. I don't want to have a premature death. Like, I try to limit things that I think are dangerous in my life. Like, I get it. But I also get very worried about reactionary things that with things like cloud seeding. It's like, listen, we're growing like crazy. We don't have a way to get more precipitation. This is one small thing. And I get worried about people getting so anxious that it leads to bad decisions down the line that could actually, like, my former state. Oh my God. When I was 7, we were in a bad drought. I remember that we had to reuse the water in our washing machine. Like, we would stop the load before it drained, take the clothes out, wring them out, put them in the dryer, and then put a new load of laundry in there and turn the dial back and then start the load again. And that was like bonkers thinking back on that. It continued. I was in my community that I moved from recently. Recently I'd traveled down there, and everybody's ripping out their front grasses and putting in these, like, cool deserty kind of things like rocks. Xeriscaping. Or I know people who put in fake turf, like all of these different things. It's like, this is all a product. I have a friend who just has a normal pool, nothing crazy. It's not leaking. His water bill's $700 a month, right? Like, here are the real consequences of making policy decisions that were not favorable to cheap utilities and abundant supply backed by safety studies, right? Like, I'm not saying let's be haphazard, but those are realities. Like, that's a reality of the community I moved from. And I would like those things to not become a reality here. And again, I live here. I don't want my kids sick. I don't want you to get sick. I don't want anybody to get sick. But like the anxiety around potentially getting sick and potentially this being a problem, like we could eliminate all cloud seeding tomorrow and it would not stop the fires that have happened all summer. It would not stop the pesticides. It would not stop, the herbicides. It would not stop the brake dust, and it would not stop the car exhaust. Like, it wouldn't stop any of it, right? Or even the pollen. I live around rolling hills with like grass everywhere. Like, there are reasons why I could be coughing or have a runny nose, right?
And it's interesting because a lot of the interest that we get in cloud seeding is usually in the summer months, in the warm season, when allergies have been triggered, when you have smoke in the air, when you have a variety of different things that you're dealing with. And so, this big question we get is cloud seeding operations occurring? I frequently get that. And no, as we've talked about, we do cloud seeding in the winter months here. And on top of that, we don't do cloud seeding over populated areas. So we're targeting high mountain elevation snowpack. And those are not areas that are populated, right? During the winter, if you were on top of a mountain in the middle of a winter storm, I mean, kudos to you. If you can, hike up there and, be up there when this is happening. But right, to cloud seed, the physical process for cloud seed to happen, there has to be an existing cloud, and so that's like one of the big critical things, like you have to seed an existing cloud formation to make it generate more precipitation. So we are looking for, one of my colleagues likes to refer to as a juicy cloud, right? These clouds that have like an abundance of liquid water content. And so a cloud, as we've discussed, is liquid water that you can see in the atmosphere. That's simply the difference, right? And the difference between the blue sky that you see is that water is in the gas form. And so when a cloud forms, it's the physical process of going from a gas to a liquid water, right? Or yes, to liquid water, right? And so cloud seeding, by contrast, we're trying to create snow or ice. And so we are going, water exists in vapor, liquid, and a solid form. So if creating clouds is going from the vapor form to the liquid form, cloud seeding or generating ice is going from the liquid form to the solid form, right? So we're talking about two very different physical processes that occur. And so when we're targeting cloud seeding, right, we need to find something that has an abundance of liquid water already available, right? So the clouds have to be there for us to be able to seed them. And there has to be certain winter conditions that occur during a storm for cloud seeding to occur, right? Or for it to even be effective.
Is this why the contrail, where it's like, hey, it was a blue sky and I saw this plane go by and I saw this trail behind it? It's like, okay, that's step one, going from gaseous form to liquid form.
Correct.
If it were actually cloud seeding, that cloud would have to already exist. And then we go from liquid to solid.
To essentially deplete the cloud, get rid of it.
To make that all fall to the ground.
Correct.
But it's essentially you're one step back. Like, we can't even do it if there isn't that already liquid form of gas. So that's why when you see Southwest Airlines fly by and other people say like, well, I saw this thing in the sky, I know this cloud seeding. It's like, look, I don't know what to tell you. I do know that Idaho does not cloud seed during the summer. They're like, well, someone is. It's like, well, then somebody is. Who is it? They're like, I don't know. It's like, that's fine. Then like, I'm not even telling you you're wrong. I just know that these industries in the state of Idaho are not responsible for this right now.
Right.
Right.
Right. And so that's sort of, how we explain it to folks, is that we only conduct it in the wintertime, and it's based upon, different physical processes. So they're not the same thing. Right. And so we often get a lot of questions of, well, then what is it? And unfortunately, we kind of go back to this idea of the aircraft condensation trails. And that's generally not a popular response. Like, folks, it seems to be hard to believe that that's what's occurring in the sky. Right. You and I talked about, if you, close the door of your shower and you crank up the heat on the shower, for example, the hotter you get that water, the more steam you're going to get in the shower, right? And you're going to be able to visually see that. Same thing with a car. If you're driving a car on a winter day, right, versus driving a car in the summer, you can't see the exhaust or the, coming out of the car during the summer, right? Because you don't have that temperature variance between warm that's coming out of your car and the cold. And so during the winter, if a car drives down the road, you kind of see that trail, right?
And you need that delta, right? Like, if I'm here in the winter and I have my window open, my bathroom window open, and I get in the shower, like, whatever the temperature is, it's going to create a huge amount of steam.
Right.
If you take that exact same temperature and you're in Florida, in the summer, you're not going to get the same amount of steam coming off of it, right? So the delta, the difference between the ambient temperature and then the temperature of the water is what plays into you being able to visibly see it. So if you're talking about sub-freezing temperatures at 30,000 feet and a jet exploding things and hyperheating up the water and condensation air and firing it out the back, bang and shoot, then that's what gives you a larger amount of visible precipitation.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And so then people kind of ask, well, then why does it hang out there, right? Why doesn't it dissipate? And that's, kind of going back to this car analogy on a cold winter day. Like if you're driving your car down the road at, maybe minimal speeds, you're going to see that exhaust kind of follow behind the car. And that's because the temperatures are cold enough to hold that water in a liquid form where you can see it, right? And so that's why in the cloud, you get these trails behind an aircraft because the condensation creates, right? And you get this liquid water vapor and then it hangs out at these cold temperatures in the air. And so then sometimes folks will ask, well, why does it spread out? Why do you have this line? And then it looks like somebody kind of took a paintbrush.
Kayla, listen, you and I have talked about a lot.
Yes.
I have a lot more questions. I would also love if you have like a meteorologist or somebody engaged in the research. If you guys have a connection to that person, I would love to talk to that person.
Absolutely.
I would love to see the like Doppler radar with the zigzag and everything. It would be lit. I'll put it up on the screen. Like, just find me someone, because again, I want to know more. Like, this is really interesting. And if it is the kind of thing where you're like, look, 2017, we literally had the plane zigzag and then we took a radar shot and you could see the zigzag and this is how we do it. So every time you see a straight line, that's not us. I would love to have that conversation. But thank you for coming today.
Absolutely.
I do appreciate you. Have we missed anything that you want to hit right here at the end?
Yeah, so I think one of the other important questions that people often ask is, for cloud seeding, how much water are we getting out of it, right?
Yeah.
And especially as a public agency, this is something that we need to be able to respond to if we're investing public dollars. Are we getting a return? Are we meeting our intended water management objectives by, doing cloud seeding? And so how do we measure that, right? Again, we just proved it worked 5 years ago. We still have a lot of work to do to figure out how it works, to quantify it, but we do have methods of sort of assessing how cloud seeding affects the precipitation, right? And so it really kind of gets into three separate questions. So when you're looking at, the value of increased water supply, I think that's a really critical message with cloud seeding, is that we are looking to increase water supply, right? So what is the value or what is the benefit of increasing water supply? Cloud seeding is simply the tool or the mechanism to get us there. So whether you build a pipeline over a mountain, whether you truck it in, or whether you cloud seed it, it's more water, right? And so for us, we want to understand, how does that impact the water supply, right? So if you generate a bunch of water, where's it going to go? How's it going to affect the system? But you have to start with understanding, well, cloud seeding increases the precipitation. So how much did it increase the precipitation? That's the first step in question one. And so how do we evaluate that? That's not something that we as an agency do. Our operators conduct that. There's other people in the industry that conduct it, and we use what's called target control analysis. And so I don't know how much Cressa had talked about this previously, but basically, there's SNOTEL sites across the West that measure snow and a number of other different important data points across a basin. And so if you have an area where you're trying to seed, and then you have an area outside of where you're trying to seed, sort of upwind, where historically they have the same climatology, right? So you can compare the climatology over several years and you can say, they have this relationship, right? These basins are pretty similar. And then if we start seeding in this one basin, the target basin, that relationship's going to change, right? And so that percentage of change between the non-seeded and the seeded is how we quantify it.
You just have control groups.
Right, exactly. Okay. And so it's a statistical method, but we certainly acknowledge that, over time, that method is going to have to be improved or replaced with modeling, because you have fire, you have human interaction, you have things that will change that relationship. And so using target control, how much do we get? I would say on an average annual across all basins, roughly 10% increase in precipitation is a pretty good estimate. And that's generally reflective of what a lot of programs see. I mean, Utah comes up with generally the same level of estimates, 5 to 10% increase in precipitation. And that can change. Again, with the water year, you have, different conditions every year. That precipitation estimate may go up and down, depending on the area. But again, that's step one. So then, okay, you increase the precipitation and the snowpack, but then that snowpack has to melt off into the water supply, right? And we know that when that happens, not all of that water naturally, before cloud seeding is introduced, some of it's going to go into the ground, some of it's going to get uptaken by plants, some of it's going to evapotranspirate into the air. So by the time that melted snow makes it to a stream gauge, you've already lost a portion of it to natural processes, right? And so then the next question is, okay, well, you increase the precipitation. How much of that actually made it to the stream flow? And so understanding that question is, cloud seeding aside, I mean, we're still trying to develop the tools and technology to understand that process, or what we call kind of a runoff ratio, how much of the snowpack makes it out of the basin. And so,
but the precipitation that was created through cloud seeding has an analogous amount of runoff, right? Like it's not like, oh, this stuff is going to evaporate sooner or later. It's like, look, whatever it is, we started with a 10% increase in the raw, and and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an interesting relationship between increasing 10%, because people are like, okay, well, you increase 10% and then it's over. It's like, not really, because what you get is a 10% increase potentially. Let's just look at agriculture. If you're in a field and you're like, okay, we have 10% more water to shoot onto these crops, it doesn't end at that point, because theoretically some gets taken up by the crops, but other amounts get actually dropped down into the aquifer to recharge. That aquifer then can be recycled throughout the years, because now people are pumping on it. It can come out through springs that charge groundwater, or surface water rather. So like that 10% increase actually can compound multiple times over usage. And it's like, a portion of that 10% is here to stay, or here to be used through many seasons and many cycles, for many different purposes.
Right. So that's that's a really important concept, to understand with cloud seeding, is that, it's not one-to-one. So when we say 10% increase in precipitation, that's not a one-to-one increase in the amount of water that you're going to see flowing past a stream gauge for those exact reasons, right? You're going to have some losses throughout there. Not all of that water makes it. So then, you kind of have this whole other animal to address of how much water makes it. And then once you figure that out, so what volume came out of the basin essentially. Right. Then you have to basically create a model of the basin and say, okay, if I added this much water, where does it go?
Right.
How does it affect the system? And so that's kind of where we're at in the process with evaluating it. Quantitatively, Idaho Power, our operator, has definitely come up with some estimates or ways of quantifying this volume using statistically based hydrologic models. And so the volume estimates that they produce coming out of this, so again, this is an average annual. This is not the amount we're saying comes every year. Some years may be more, some years may be less, but on an average annual, so all the projects that we operate in the collaborative, that includes the Payette River Basin, which is operated independently by Idaho Power, but in coordination, right? Because weather doesn't really know boundaries. Right. Then you have the Boise, the Wood, and the Upper Snake. So between these four basins, volumetrically, we estimate about 1.24 million acre feet on an average annual basis. So that's additional water, 1.2 million acre feet of additional water. And so to put that into context, here in the Boise area, the three reservoir systems that make up the Boise Basin, so that's the Anderson Ranch, Arrow Rock, and Lucky Peak, there's about 1 million acre feet of water in that system. So imagine creating enough water on an average annual basis to fill the entire Boise reservoir system. In East Idaho, that's Palisades Reservoir, right? A little over 1 million acre foot. So it's a pretty significant amount of water that you're talking about. It seems like a small percentage, but volumetrically, when you're talking about that across the basin, even a 5 to 10% increase is a lot, and so then you compare that to the cost of the program, and you're looking at the cost of water. The cost to operate in these basins that I've just described, we're looking at, roughly a little over $3 million. So, $3 million cost divided by 1 million acre feet, you're somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 an acre foot. That is some of the cheapest water you're going to get,
And considering that the wrangle with the pump farmers and the surface water farmers this spring that everybody all of a sudden got educated on out of nowhere, cobalt miners. That was essentially an argument over, I believe it was 76,000 acre feet in one of the 7 canals. And they're like, look, we're estimating that we're going to be short 76,000 acre feet. So the fact that you're producing 1.2 million acre feet, you're dwarfing the amount that actually led to a potential shutdown of people's farm. And
even if you folks are like, wow, is that number actually right? And again, we're developing the tools and technology, but even if that number off by a magnitude of half, right? So even if we were only coming up with half that amount of water and the cost, you're still in the $10 to $12 $1 an acre foot range, right? And when you look at the cost to rent water or get water from other places, again, it's very cheap water, and so that's, again, why the state has made some of these investments into cloud seeding.
Kayla, there's a lot here. God bless it.
Yes,
thank you for coming in.
absolutely.
Please come in again. I'd love to have the conversation continue, and I'm sure people will have questions after this, and we can just keep banging them out, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.